Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are going to step back in time, about 2,500 years, to a rocky peninsula jutting out into the Aegean Sea. We are going to ancient Athens, the birthplace of an idea so powerful it would reshape the entire world, democracy. But before we get to the shouting crowds and the stone voting tokens, we have to understand what life was like before this radical experiment began. You see, for centuries, the idea that ordinary people could rule themselves was completely unthinkable. It was absurd. The world was run by kings, tyrants, and small groups of wealthy families who believed they had a divine right to power. Power didn't flow upward from the people, it crashed down from the top like a waterfall. In early Athens, this was no different. The city was controlled by a group of aristocrats, the Eupatridae, which literally means the well-born. They owned the best land, they controlled the law, and they made all the decisions. If you were a common farmer and your crops failed, you might have to borrow money from a rich aristocrat. When you couldn't pay it back, you wouldn't just lose your farm, you, your wife, and your children could be sold into slavery to settle the debt. The law wasn't written down, so the aristocrats could interpret it however they wanted, usually in their own favor. The average person had zero political rights and no legal protection. Imagine that kind of grinding helplessness, where your entire life is at the mercy of someone else's whim. This was a recipe for disaster. The pressure was building up like steam inside a sealed pot. The common people were furious, and it became clear that if the aristocrats didn't give up some of their power, the whole city would explode into a violent revolution. Something had to give, and it was this desperate need to avoid self-destruction that unknowingly set the stage for the very first steps toward a system where the people, the demos, would finally have a voice. As the tensions in Athens reached a boiling point, with the poor and the rich at each other's throats, the city turned to a man with a reputation for wisdom and fairness. His name was Solon. Around the year 594 before the Common Era, Solon was given an almost impossible task: rewrite the entire system and save the city from civil war. Now, Solon was an aristocrat himself, but he wasn't a fan of the greedy behavior of his own class. The very first thing he did was a massive shock to the system. He declared that all debts that had turned free Athenians into slaves were wiped clean. He outlawed the practice of debt slavery entirely. Imagine the seismic impact of that. In one stroke, he liberated a huge chunk of the population and redefined what it meant to be an Athenian citizen. If you were a free Athenian, your body could no longer be used as collateral. This created a basic sense of human dignity. But Solon went much further. He didn't believe in equality of outcome, but he believed in institutional fairness. He divided the population into 4 property classes based on agricultural output, not birth. The wealthiest could be elected to the highest offices, but the poorest class, the Vates, who owned almost nothing, were granted a right that had been unthinkable before: they could sit in the assembly and serve on juries. For the first time, the ordinary man had a formal, constitutional role in government. He wasn't just a subject, he was a participant, even if only in a limited way. Solon also created a council of 400 to prepare business for the assembly, ensuring the aristocrats couldn't completely control the agenda. When his work was done, Solon did something remarkable. He didn't make himself a tyrant. He left Athens for 10 years, forcing the people to maintain his laws on their own. While his reforms didn't create a full democracy overnight, he had planted the seed. He had dismantled a government based purely on birth and replaced it with one based on civic responsibility and a little bit of wealth. Solon's reforms were a brilliant first step, but they didn't create peace. In fact, the old aristocratic families simply regrouped and began fighting amongst themselves for power, completely ignoring the spirit of Solon's laws. Athens fractured into regional factions, each backed by a powerful noble family. Out of this chaos emerged a shrewd and ambitious figure named Pisistratus. Now, his name might sound like a villain in a Greek tragedy, and in a way, he was a tyrant. But to understand the rise of democracy, you have to understand this paradox. Pisistratus, the tyrant, accidentally strengthened the common people and weakened the aristocrats, paving the way for more democracy. He seized power 3 times, and his methods were pure political theater. On his second attempt, he rode into the city in a chariot accompanied by a tall, beautiful woman dressed as the goddess Athena herself, claiming the goddess was personally welcoming him back. The people, supposedly, believed it. As a ruler, Pisistratus was surprisingly popular. He implemented policies that directly benefited the common farmer. He offered state loans to small farmers so they wouldn't fall back into debt to the nobles. He introduced traveling judges to the rural villages, which was a masterstroke. Before this, if a poor farmer in a distant village had a legal dispute, he had to travel all the way to the city and have his case heard by a noble who was probably friends with his opponent. Now, justice came to him. This quietly eroded the local power of the aristocrats. Pisistratus also poured resources into grand public works projects, building temples and aqueducts, which gave jobs to the unemployed. He standardized the economy and promoted Athenian art and the great Panathenaic festival, giving all Athenians a shared cultural identity, not just a family-based one. By breaking the exclusive hold of the nobles on political power through force and popular appeal, Pisistratus showed the people that the state could work for them. Even though he was a dictator, his rule left the aristocrats weaker and the common citizens more confident and unified. After Pisistratus was gone, his sons took over and ruled harshly, losing all the goodwill their father had built. The Athenians, with help from Sparta, kicked them out. But the moment the tyranny fell, the old aristocratic families immediately tried to bring back their exclusive power system. A nobleman named Isagoras tried to establish an oligarchy of just 300 of his richest friends. He didn't just want to beat his rivals, he wanted to dissolve the assembly and purge the city of 700 families he deemed undesirable. This was the final straw. The common people of Athens, who had been promised a return to freedom, didn't just protest. They did something revolutionary. They spontaneously rose up, armed themselves, and trapped Isagoras and his Spartan allies on the Acropolis. They besieged them for 3 days until they surrendered and were banished. This was a people's revolution. The Athenians then recalled a man who had been exiled by Isagoras, a true visionary named Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes, seeing the raw power of the organized people, understood that a new foundation had to be built from scratch. His system, established around 508 before the Common Era, is the true birth of classical Athenian democracy. He didn't just tweak the old system, he destroyed the old tribal loyalties. He divided Attica, the territory of Athens, into 3 regions, the coast, the inland, and the city. He then created 10 entirely new, artificial tribes. Crucially, each new tribe was a mix of people from the coast, the inland, and the city. A fisherman, an olive farmer, and a city merchant were now in the same political unit. This was a stroke of genius. It shattered the regional power bases of the old aristocratic families. You could no longer command a tribe just because you owned land in one area. Cleisthenes then set up a new council of 500, with 50 members from each of the 10 new tribes, chosen not by election, but by a lottery. Every citizen had a chance to serve. He called his system isonomia, meaning equality under the law, not rule by the mob. This wasn't just a reform, it was a complete refounding of the state. Just as this fragile new democracy was finding its feet, a threat of unimaginable scale descended upon Greece that would test the Athenian spirit to its absolute limit: the Persian Empire. This wasn't just a war for land, it was an existential struggle that would forge democracy in fire. The first shock came at the Battle of Marathon in 490 before the Common Era. A massive Persian force landed on the plains of Marathon, intending to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion. The Athenians were horribly outnumbered, maybe 2-1. They sent a runner to Sparta for help, but the Spartans were celebrating a religious festival and couldn't leave until the full moon. The Athenians were on their own. In the Athenian assembly, a heated debate raged: should they defend the walls or march out to meet the enemy? The vote was to march. An army of citizen soldiers, mostly hoplite farmers not professional warriors, lined up on the plain. They weren't fighting for a king's ambition, they were fighting for their homes, their farms, and their new political freedom. And against all odds, they charged. The Athenian center was thin, but their wings were strong. They smashed through the Persian flanks and enveloped the center, routing the invaders in a panic back to their ships. It was a victory that seemed impossible. For the Athenian citizen, a profound new idea was cemented: the free man in an open democracy could outperform the slave of a despot. 10 years later, the Persians returned, this time with a vast army and navy. Under the leadership of the brilliant general Themistocles, the Athenians made an incredible sacrifice. A prophecy had said safety would lie in a wooden wall. Themistocles interpreted the wooden wall not as the old thorn bush palisade of the Acropolis, but as the hulls of their ships. He convinced the assembly to abandon the entire city. Imagine the agony of that vote. The Athenians evacuated their women and children to nearby islands, and every able-bodied man took to the wooden warships, the triremes. The poorest citizens, the vates who couldn't afford hoplite armor, became the rowers. In the Battle of Salamis, they destroyed the Persian fleet. Democracy wasn't just a political theory anymore, it was the system that had saved Greece. More importantly, the poor rowers, who had powered the victory, now rightfully demanded an equal political voice in the city they had saved. The aftermath of the Persian defeat completely transformed the balance of power inside Athens. Before the wars, a man's military value was tied to his wealth. A rich man could afford the bronze armor of a hoplite and fight in the phalanx. A poor man could only throw stones from a distance. But the victory at Salamis wasn't won by the hoplites on land, it was won by the rowers in the tight, dangerous confines of a wooden trireme. These rowers were the vates, the lowest property class, the men who owned nothing. They had saved the city, and when they returned to the charred ruins of Athens, they were not the same politically invisible class they had been before. Their labor, their sweat, and their nerve had literally propelled the ship of state to safety. This led to a dramatic and permanent democratization of the government. If a poor man could be trusted with an oar in a battle that decided the fate of civilization, how could he not be trusted with a vote? The old Solonian rules, where the highest offices were still reserved for the wealthy, began to feel archaic and unjust. The pressure from the newly empowered commoners was unstoppable. It was during this period, starting in the 460s before the Common Era, that a leader named Ephialtes and later the famous Pericles launched a full-scale assault on the remaining aristocratic privileges. Their target was a council of ex-archons called the Areopagus, which was essentially a retirement club for rich old nobles who held enormous political sway as a vague guardian of the constitution. Ephialtes stripped the Areopagus of almost all its political powers, leaving it only with jurisdiction over homicide cases. He transferred its powers to the democratic bodies, the Assembly, the Council of 500, and the popular law courts. This was a hostile takeover. The aristocrats were so furious that Ephialtes was assassinated. But his murder didn't stop the tide. It only proved that the power of the people was the new reality. The link between military service, personal sacrifice, and political rights was now absolute. The navy didn't just protect the democracy from foreign enemies, it created a massive block of patriotic, empowered citizens who had a direct, visceral investment in the political system they were rowing for. Following the assassination of Ephialtes, a new leader stepped onto the stage who would give his name to an entire era. His name was Pericles. For decades, he was the dominant figure in Athenian politics, and he pushed the democratic experiment to its logical, and most radical, extreme. Pericles was an aristocrat by birth, a brilliant orator, and a passionate advocate for the common people against his own class. He understood that a true democracy required not just the right to participate, but the practical ability to do so. His most revolutionary innovation was the introduction of state pay for public service. Until now, a poor farmer couldn't afford to take a day off work to sit in the assembly or serve on a jury. Politics was a luxury of the rich. Pericles introduced a daily wage, the mistos, for jurors first, and later for members of the council and even for attending the main assembly meetings. This was an earthquake. It meant that a cobbler, a potter, or a rower could now afford to govern. For the critics of democracy, this was the ultimate corruption, paying the poor to do the work of the state. But for Pericles, it was the only way to make citizenship universal. He also restricted citizenship only to those born to two Athenian parents, which, while exclusionary to outsiders, raised the status of every Athenian commoner. Under his leadership, the public courts, the Heliaea, became a massive force. Every year, 6,000 jurors were selected by lot. A regular trial could have a jury of 501 citizens. There were no judges to instruct them on the law, and there were no lawyers. A citizen had to speak for himself, and the jury decided both fact and law. This was the people's absolute sovereignty over justice. Pericles also channeled the tribute from the Athenian Empire into a massive building program. On the Acropolis, still scarred by the Persian destruction, he commissioned the Parthenon. This wasn't just a temple, it was a colossal statement of democratic pride, built by and for the ordinary citizens of the city. In his funeral oration, he defined the Athenian ideal: a man who takes no part in public affairs is not just minding his own business, but is useless. The state was no longer a ruler, it was the collective project of every citizen. To truly understand the radical nature of this democracy, we need to look at the machinery itself, the strange and ingenious tools they used to make it work on a daily basis. The central power in Athens was the assembly, the ecclesia. This was not a representative parliament where you elect someone to decide for you. This was a direct democracy. Any adult male citizen could attend, speak, and vote. They met on a hill called the Nix, overlooking the Acropolis. Imagine 4,000 to 6,000 citizens gathering before dawn. The session began with a herald asking, "Who wishes to speak?" Any common man, a farmer, a tanner, could step forward onto the speaker's platform, or bema. There was complete freedom of speech, called isagoria, but it was not without risk. If you proposed something illegal or foolish, you could be impeached and face severe penalties. The assembly decided on war, treaties, and public projects. They didn't just rubber-stamp decisions, they debated and voted directly. But the most uniquely democratic institution was the Council of 500, selected by lottery. A clariterion was a stone slab with slots for the bronze identity tickets of citizens. Black and white dice were dropped down a tube, determining who would be a councillor for that year. The use of a lottery was deeply political. Elections, in their view, were inherently aristocratic because a poor man with no fame could never win against a wealthy, well-educated orator. The lottery was a profound expression of equality. It asserted that any random citizen was capable of governing. The council prepared the agenda for the assembly and handled day-to-day administration. Then there was the famous practice of ostracism. Once a year, the assembly could decide to hold a vote where a citizen could be exiled for 10 years without losing his property. If they voted yes, citizens would scratch a name onto a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon. The man with the most votes, if it reached a quorum of 6,000, had to leave. There was no trial, no charge. It was purely a safety valve to remove a person who was becoming too popular, too powerful, or a threat to the democratic equality. It was a way of saying, you are getting a little too big for our democratic boots. This system was not run by distant officials, it was a living, breathing, often chaotic machine operated directly by the people. For all its brilliance, this Athenian democracy was a fragile and deeply flawed experiment, and the very features that made it so dynamic also contained the seeds of its potential downfall. The speed and directness of the system meant that the mood of the assembly could swing wildly. There was no pause button, no second chamber to cool down the hot emotions of the crowd. An eloquent but dangerous demagogue, a kind of manipulative speaker, could whip the citizenry into a frenzy, leading them to disastrous decisions that they would later regret. The most infamous example of this was the Mytilenean debate during the Peloponnesian War. The city of Mytilene had rebelled against Athenian control. In their anger, the assembly initially voted to send a ship with orders to execute every single adult male in the rebellious city and enslave the women and children. It was a vote of pure, genocidal rage. The next morning, the citizens woke up and realized the horror of what they had done. A second assembly was hastily gathered, and after an agonizing debate, they reversed the decision. A second trireme was launched, its rowers rowing through the night, eating their rations at their benches, arriving just as the original death sentence was being read out. They stopped the massacre by a matter of minutes. It was a stark lesson that the direct rule of the people, without institutional breaks, could become mob rule. The atrocities didn't stop there. In the case of the small island of Melos, which simply wanted to remain neutral in the war, the Athenians dropped all pretense of justice. In a chilling dialogue recorded by the historian Thucydides, the Athenian envoys told the Melians that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The assembly voted to kill all the adult men and enslave the rest. This was the dark, imperialistic flip side of the confident, humanistic Athens of Pericles. The democracy was also fundamentally exclusive. Women had no political voice and lived highly restricted lives. The city's economy and silver mines relied heavily on the brutal exploitation of enslaved people, who of course had no rights whatsoever. The very democracy that spoke so highly of freedom was built on the labor of a massive population who had none. This internal contradiction and the recklessness of direct popular rule highlighted the fragility of the entire brilliant, terrifying experiment. Like all dramatic stories, the story of Athenian democracy ends not with a whimper, but with a catastrophic crash. The long and devastating Peloponnesian War against Sparta, which had dragged on for 27 years, finally broke Athens. The Democratic Assembly's own impulsive decisions, the catastrophic overreach of the Sicilian expedition where they voted to invade Sicily without even knowing its size, had squandered their army and navy. In 404 before the Common Era, a starving Athens surrendered. The Spartans tore down the long walls connecting the city to its port to the music of flute girls, convinced they had killed democracy for good. They immediately installed a brutal oligarchic regime of 30 men, known as the 30 Tyrants. For a year, Athens fell into a nightmare of political murder, property confiscation, and tyranny. The experiment seemed dead. But it wasn't. The democratic spirit was so deeply ingrained in the Athenian identity that the people fought back. A resistance group of Democrats gathered at a border fort and fought their way back into the city, restoring the democracy in 403. This restored democracy was more cautious and more legalistic, having learned the bitter lessons of unfiltered mob rule, but it survived. It survived for nearly another century until it was finally absorbed by the rising power of Macedonia. But the idea never died. It became a legend. When the founding fathers of the United States or the revolutionaries in France thought about government by the people, they looked back at this one small, rocky city from 2,000 years ago. They learned from its glory, and they learned from its fatal flaws. They added representation, checks and balances, and written constitutions to protect against the very demagogues and rash votes that had damaged Athens. What happened in Athens was not a perfect system, but the first spark of a truly radical idea, that a poor man with no social standing, no powerful family, and no fame could be the custodian of his own society. The word democracy itself comes from that city. Demos, the people, and kratos, power. Power to the people. It was a moment in history when ordinary men, through chaos and courage, violence and persuasion, reached out and took control of their own destiny,